Well, as we heard in the report, they're not reacting very much. They deny any involvement, an opinion that you quite often hear in Ukraine when things like this happen. Happened the same with the assassination of Dugin's daughter, the daughter of the famous Russian pro-Putin philosopher. The Ukrainians say, no, it definitely wasn't us, but it's perhaps not a bad thing if the Russians think that it was, because they think that anything that brings the war home in a way to Russians, anything that makes them think that maybe they're not so secure in cities like St Petersburg and Moscow as they would like to be, is perhaps a good thing in the long run for Ukraine in terms of perhaps changing Russian attitudes to the war and making them at least think about it a bit and perhaps cease supporting it as much as, in the perception of Ukrainians, and there is sociological data attesting to this, though I would suggest the sociological data is perhaps not entirely credible. But in the perception of Ukrainians, almost all Russians support the war. That's something that it's quite important to remember. And so there are some people in Ukraine saying, well, yeah, maybe it's quite good if they think that it was us. So maybe that's one reason why there haven't been too many sort of vocal protestations suggesting that it's making sure that the Ukrainians make clear that they are rejecting any responsibility for this. But analysts say that it's much more likely that this has something to do with some internal conflict, perhaps between Prigozhin and some other members of the Wagner group, or perhaps it was a warning to Yevgeny Prigozhin that he could be next, that nobody's safe anywhere, because this Vladlen had clearly connections with the Wagner group. He'd been photographed with weapons in Ukraine and alongside members of the Wagner group. So it might have something to do with that, but that's all speculation, really. One thing also perhaps worth underlining is the Russians so easily talking here about the idea, as they accuse the Ukrainians of Ukraine collaborating with supporters of Alexei Navalny. Ukraine doesn't really have very good relations with Alexei Navalny and his foundations. A lot of Ukrainians are very, very suspicious about him. It's not as though Ukraine is working hand in hand with the Russian opposition in that way, as apparently the Russians, in terms of the narrative they're trying to spin about this, are trying to make the world believe.
Now, Gulliver, on Sunday we heard the Russian mercenary organization, the Wagner Group, claiming that they'd raised a flag right in the middle of that war-torn city, the city of Bakhmut. What's the situation there in Bakhmut as far as your sources are concerned?
Well, the video is credible. Yevgeny Prigozhin, judging by what's in the background, was there on the site of, and I think we have to say, the former city hall in Bakhmut. Whether that means the Russians really have firm control over the area, we don't know. The Ukrainian side denies it. I've since seen a video of where exactly they raised the flag. It's on a pile of rubble. There isn't a town hall there anymore. So claiming that that has any significance in terms of how the Russians may exercise control over the city is clearly ridiculous. If it's a victory at all, it's a symbolic victory. But certainly it does appear as though the Russians have gained some ground in the center of Bakhmut. I spoke earlier to someone who'd recently been out there talking to soldiers there, and the reports coming in, though I stress these are coming to me secondhand, I'm sorry, I haven't been there for 3 weeks to that area, saying that it's not fighting block by block anymore, it's fighting story by story inside multi-story buildings, that there might be one floor controlled by the Russians and another floor controlled by the Ukrainians. That's how close this battle is right in the center of Bakhmut.
And Gulliver, just lastly, on Saturday, Russia took over the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council. What's been the reaction in Kyiv to that?
The reaction and the pre-reaction, if you like. Ukraine had been saying before this happened that it was absolutely terrible, denouncing it as absurd. Volodymyr Zelensky, for a long time, has been calling for an absolute overhaul of international institutions, including the UN Security Council, pointing out that the fact that Russia and also China have vetoes on the Security Council is really hampering their ability to do anything effectively. He's not he's not alone in saying this at all. There are leading figures in the Republican Party in the United States who've been saying the same thing. And Fiona Hill, who was the Russia specialist in the Trump administration and later testified against Trump, if you remember, a very, very respected intellectual commenting on these matters, also seems to be saying that the Ukrainians really have got a point with this.